The book of Daniel is one of the most popular in the Old Testament, maybe even the Bible. Some people love its stories of faithfulness to God and bravery in the face of death, stories like the lion's den and the fiery furnace. Others love its grand dreams of mutant beasts, a splendid tree, and a magnificent multi-layered statue that gets crushed to bits and blown away with the wind. Whatever your reasons for loving the book of Daniel, or for simply wanting to study it because it's God's inspired word, I'm glad that you've joined me for this study. We will make our way through the book chapter by chapter for the most part, and as we go, we'll consider how the stories and how the book as a whole contributes to the whole story of God told throughout the Bible. We'll also consider how it reveals a story that God continues to write today, both in the pages of history and in our individual lives. But as we begin our study, we want to ask key questions that we should ask of any text when we approach it. We want to ask who wrote the book and when. We want to ask when was it written and for what purpose. We want to ask what kind of writing is it? That is, what is its genre? These are basic interpretive questions, but with respect to the book of Daniel, none of the questions has a straightforward answer. Let's start with the question of authorship. Who is the author, and when was the book written? The traditional answer to the authorship question is that Daniel wrote it while living in Babylonian exile in the 6th century BC. This view comes out of the second half of the book, where we find a collection of first-person accounts of visions that Daniel received. But by contrast, the first half of the book consists of third-person accounts of events that happened to Daniel and his friends while they served in the royal court of Babylon. In the traditional view of authorship, Daniel also wrote these narrative chapters, but he wrote them as an omniscient narrator instead of as a participant. But there is a second view on the authorship of Daniel. Since as early as the 3rd century, some have thought it was written by an anonymous Jew writing under the revered name of Daniel during the 2nd century BC, when the Jews were suffering great persecution under Gentile rule. This view grew out of some historical difficulties in the first half of the book and the nature of the prophecy in the second half. We'll mention some of the historical difficulties as we work through the lessons ahead, but let me just say something here about the nature of prophecy in chapters 7 through 12, especially in chapter 11. These chapters contain a detailed prophecy of events that is unlike anything else in the Bible. It's not hard to fill in the right names and places and feel like you're reading a history book. But prophecy in the Bible isn't usually so specific and detailed. So because of this, some critical scholars have argued that the prophecy was written using a literary device called Eventu Prophecy. That is, prophecy after the event. This device involves a prophet casting history in the form of a prediction. The purpose of using this device in Daniel would have been to show how God had orchestrated history in order to remind his people, his suffering people, that he was in control of their circumstances. So in Daniel 11, we have a prophecy of history from the time of Cyrus's Persia in the 6th century BC to the reign of Antiochus IV Epiphanes in the 2nd century BC. It is during the prophecy of Antiochus's reign that the author of Daniel shifts to genuine prophecy, and he gets some details wrong, as might happen with humanly generated prophecy of the future. Now, this is unusual to us, but this device is known elsewhere in the ancient Near East, so it's not impossible that the book of Daniel could use it. Some conservative scholars reduce this view of Daniel's authorship to a claim that those who hold it do not believe in genuine predictive prophecy. That is, people who hold the 2nd century view of authorship do so because they don't think the real Daniel could have accurately prophesied events of the next several centuries. But this isn't necessarily the case. And while it can be easy for Christians to use issues like this as litmus tests for orthodoxy, we must be careful. Evangelical scholars who share a high view of Scripture disagree on the date of Daniel. My position on the issue is that the book of Daniel reflects events that happened to a real Daniel and his friends in Babylonian exile, and that the book's prophecies are accurate, However, the question of who wrote the narratives, who compiled the book as we know it, what editorial work might have been done in it, and when all these things happened, is not one that can be definitively answered. Let's move to a second basic interpretive question. What is the genre of the book? You may have learned the book of Daniel as one of the four major prophets: Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel. And in English Bibles, the book is grouped with the prophetic books. But if you were to look at the collection of Old Testament books in a Hebrew Bible, you wouldn't find Daniel among the group of books called the prophets. Rather, it's grouped with a collection called the Writings, which contains several books we consider poetry, Job all the way through Song of Solomon, and several we consider history, Ruth, Chronicles, Ezra through Esther, and Lamentations. How the Hebrew collection, or the Hebrew canon, and the English canon came together is a complicated history. But for our purposes, we should at least ask why the book of Daniel is in different places in them. For the most part, the groupings in each canon are according to genre. That is, similar books are grouped together: history with history, poetry with poetry, prophecy with prophecy. But the challenge of the book of Daniel is that it does not have a single genre. The first 6 chapters are narrative. They're stories. The last 6 chapters are apocalyptic visions with prophecies of the future. Given this, it appears that the Hebrew and the English canons chose to focus on different genres when they grouped the books together. In the Hebrew Bible, Daniel is classified as narrative, and it's put with other narrative books that recount Jewish history of and beyond the exile. In the canon represented by most English Bibles, Daniel is classified as apocalyptic or prophecy, and so it's grouped with the prophets. There are other factors in canon formation too, but this is where we'll have to leave the issue. Another interpretive question that applies specifically to Daniel has to do with its use of languages. Unlike other Old Testament books, Daniel is written in 2 languages, Hebrew and its sister language, Aramaic. Chapter 1 is in Hebrew, then chapters 2 through 7 are in Aramaic, and chapters 8 through 12 are back in Hebrew. Why the book contains 2 languages isn't obvious, nor is it ever explained in the book. So several theories have been proposed, but none has gained consensus. A further issue that relates to the use of 2 languages is the fact that they're integral to the structure of the book. What I mean by that is that the book neatly divides between its 2 genres. Chapters 1 through 6 are narrative, chapters 7 through 12 are apocalyptic. But the Aramaic chapters are not all one or the other. They begin in chapter 2's narrative, and they continue for 4 more narrative chapters. And then the last Aramaic chapter, chapter 7, is part of the apocalyptic half of the book. Further, the 6 Aramaic chapters, chapters 2 through 7, create a chiastic structure. The word chiasm comes from the Greek word chi, or chi, which looks like an X. A chiastic structure is a literary structure in which parallel sections appear in an inverted arrangement. Let me explain how the Aramaic chiasm works in the larger structure of the book. The first chapter is in Hebrew, and it functions as a prologue to the entire book. Then chapters 2 through 7 are the Aramaic chapters, and they are, for the most part, stories about Jews in Gentile nations. We'll come back to these chapters in a minute. And then chapters 8 through 12 are back in Hebrew, and they're prophecies about Jews back in their land after the exile. So let's look more closely at the 6 Aramaic chapters. The first and the last chapters, chapters 2 and 7, are both about visions or dreams that involve 4 earthly kingdoms and a 5th eternal kingdom. In chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar has a dream, and in chapter 7, Daniel has a vision. And then the 2nd and 5th chapters, chapters 3 and 6, are about faithful Jews facing death for their faith. In chapter 3, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are thrown into the fiery furnace. And in chapter 6, Daniel's thrown into the lion's den. And then the central chapters of the structure, chapters 4 and 5, are both about proud Gentile kings being humbled by God. In chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar is humbled, and in chapter 5, Belshazzar is humbled. The clear structure of these 6 chapters and the fact that they are the Aramaic chapters suggests to me that the use of 2 languages in Daniel was an intentional decision and that it served some literary purpose. Well, what might that purpose be? As we work through the book, you'll observe that the 6 chapters of Aramaic are primarily about events that happened in the royal courts of Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar, and then Media under Darius. Aramaic was the commercial language of exile, and it was the language in the royal court, so that might explain why it's used in these chapters that pertain to life there. The language reflected that God's people were foreigners. Chapter 7 doesn't fit into this description very neatly, but we'll talk more about the role of chapter 7 in a bit. And then when the book of Daniel shifts from its focus on life in exile and it addresses the Jews' future back in the land of Israel, it goes back to Hebrew. This is chapters 8 through 12. If this is the pattern behind the use of 2 languages, we might expect chapter 1 to be written in Aramaic instead of Hebrew, since it is about the beginning of the Jews' time in exile and in the royal court. But perhaps chapter 1 is meant to be more of a prologue to the entire book, and that's why it's in Hebrew. I also think that in addition to simply representing the life of God's people among foreigners, the use of the Aramaic chiastic structure gives us the key themes that underline the entire book. There is no manual from the ancient world about how these structures were used, but most scholars think that the focus of the entire chiasm is what is in the center. The heart captures the structure's overall message. In the Aramaic chiasm of Daniel 2 through 7, there are 2 chapters that share the center, chapters 4 and 5, and both are accounts of proud human kings that God humbled. The first is Nebuchadnezzar in chapter 4, the second is Belshazzar in chapter 5. Why did God humble them? Well, for 12 chapters, the book of Daniel tells us that God alone is sovereign, and He is the one who bestows power on human rulers. When those rulers start to think they are the ones responsible for their power, God sets them straight. We see this truth vividly illustrated in the story of Nebuchadnezzar's dream about the tree and in Belshazzar's experience with the handwriting on the wall. Around these 2 central chapters, the heart of the chiasm, are chapters that add to our perspective on the relationship between the divine king and human kings, and chapters that show us how God's people should live in the tension that often exists between the 2 kinds of kings. In chapters 2 and 7, which form the outer sections of the chiasm, there's a cosmic scope, both in terms of time and in terms of space. Nebuchadnezzar's dream about the statue in Daniel 2 and Daniel's vision of the 4 beasts in chapter 7 highlight the history of human kingdoms, and it follows them to their demise before the kingdom of God, which will last forever. While Nebuchadnezzar's dream emphasizes the splendor and strength of human kingdoms, Daniel's vision reveals the evil and arrogance of human kingdoms. In the 2 middle chapters, chapters 3 and 6, we have 2 illustrations of what God's followers might expect as they live under human rulers and seek to remain faithful to God. Some human kings are overtly and aggressively hostile, as Nebuchadnezzar was to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But others, like Darius in the account of Daniel in the lion's den, are agreeable, but they're also weak and easily trapped by forces greater than their own good intentions. The examples of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in chapter 3 and the example of Daniel in chapter 6 show us how to be faithful to God regardless of the national climate and despite what such faithfulness might cost. In the 2 central chapters of the chiasm, chapters 4 and 5, we again see examples of the relationship between divine kingship and human kingship. But here we have specific examples of 2 individual kings whose pride brought God's judgment. Both were humbled by God, but their circumstances were drastically different and appear to have been based on their attitudes toward being humbled and their willingness to submit to God's authority. From the Aramaic Chiasm, and with these important themes in mind, the book of Daniel moves into the apocalyptic visions of chapters 8 through 12, visions of the future, which focus on the suffering of God's people at the hands of Gentile kings. The assault against God and his people in Daniel's visions far exceeds what the people faced under the kings of the exile, Nebuchadnezzar, Belshazzar, Darius. Under those kings, Daniel and his friends were able to influence the foreign kings for good. But in the apocalyptic visions, the only thing God's people can do is endure and remain faithful and cling to the hope of everlasting reward for themselves and everlasting judgment for their oppressors. So while the emphases of the book's two sections differ, they share the themes established in the Aramaic Chiasm. The sovereign God brings proud human rulers low, and his people can remain faithful in the midst of suffering. At the heart of the book is chapter 7. It is part of the Aramaic Chiasm, but it's also one of the apocalyptic visions. It interlocks the book's two languages and its two genres. The chapter also serves to tie God's past faithfulness, the faithfulness evidenced in the narrative chapters, to the uncertain future facing the Jews, the future disclosed to Daniel in his visions. Daniel's vision in chapter 7 of the one like a son of man receiving the kingdom and the saints ruling forever with him is a glorious vision that gives us the book's first look at what lies beyond suffering. And it offers such a great hope that God's people can find the strength to endure until they realize their reward. The last thing we want to consider as we begin this study of Daniel is its theology. What does it teach us about God? What do we learn about ourselves in relationship to God? The main message of the book of Daniel is simple. God is in control, no matter how things look, and his kingdom will one day fill the earth. He is the King of Kings, the sovereign and eternal King. Throughout the book, which shows God's interactions with Gentile kings, the names most commonly used for God are those that make it clear he is not just the God of the Jews. He is not one of many territorial gods who fight for control over various regions. He is the God of heaven, the Lord of heaven. He is the God of gods, the Lord of lords, the living God, the Most High. All of these titles reveal God's transcendence, his sovereignty over all things. But the book also shows him to be very near to his people. He is our God, my God, the God of the covenant, the one who is compassionate and forgiving. The book also highlights God's sovereign eternal rule through the activity of Gentile kings and then God's responses to them. So as Nebuchadnezzar flexes his royal muscles in chapters 2 and 3, the Most High God responds with a display of his matchless power and wisdom. When Belshazzar raises his fist at God, he discovers he's no match for the God of heaven. Gentile kings learn that they depend on this God for their lives and their power. God shared his wisdom and power, but he also takes it away. What do we learn about ourselves in relationship to God in the book of Daniel? We learn what it means to be a citizen of his eternal kingdom. We live in exile and expectation, and we await the unobstructed rule of God on earth. The book affirms that God was not done with his people, the Jews, even though they would continue to live under foreign domination for much of their existence. We see how kings have varying responses to their God-delegated authority. We also see how they respond to God's people in light of what they think of God. In some cases, God's people can thrive, as the 4 Judean exiles did in chapter 1, rising to the top of the king's court. And even though the exiles faced situations of hostility, the fiery furnace and the lion's den, they also were able to influence their environment for good. But then at other times, particularly those illustrated in the second half of the book, foreign kings oppressed God's people with every intention of destroying them. And in all this suffering, we get glimpses of greater cosmic battles behind earthly battles. Conflicts that we see here reflect conflict in the heavenly realm, and it will be so until God's kingdom comes in all its fullness. we may get caught in the crises of such conflicts, and God may or may not choose to deliver us from the resulting suffering. As citizens of God's eternal kingdom, we live in expectation of future vindication and reward. We await resurrection, judgment, inheritance of the kingdom. We await the day when all peoples, nations, languages will together praise the sovereign, eternal King forever. Until then, we live in both exile and expectation, knowing that no matter how things look, God is in control, and his kingdom will fill the earth at his appointed time.